played this game for the first time, I was enjoying it, but I remember a specific moment when I became hooked. When you confront the terrorist leader, you remember, the guy with no hair? Listen to some of what he has to say.
For 100 years, there's been a conspiracy of plutocrats against ordinary people.
You have a single fact to back that up?
Number one, in 1945, corporations paid 50% of federal taxes. Now they pay about 5%. Number two, in 1900, 90% of Americans were self-employed. Now it's about 2%.
So?
It's called consolidation. Strengthen governments and corporations, weaken individuals. With taxes, this can be done imperceptibly over time.
I became very interested in this game after hearing that. So yeah, that makes me kind of a nerd getting excited that a game is talking about tax rates, but that's because I knew what he was saying was actually true. Now, it's a little more complicated than what he says because it was never a pure 50%, since there was also payroll tax, but the point is, you bet individuals are paying more taxes than corporations are nowadays. I mean, a better measure is effective tax rate. This isn't the official tax rate, this is the real tax for corporations after all the loopholes. Also, this isn't the year 2052. That could affect your numbers too. Now, as for the self-employment thing, I wasn't able to get numbers as far back as he's quoting, but what I did find shows that, yeah, self-employment is way down from where it used to be. We have a ton more consolidation now. Now that number is actually going up right now, but not in a good way. That's due to corporations using less and less employees and hiring disposable contractors because then they don't have to pay out as much for benefits, insurance, and so on. So if you do freelance work for what amounts to less than minimum wage, congratulations, you're self-employed. This all adds up to power moving away from the individual towards large institutions. Now, the terrorist guy claims it's a conspiracy of plutocrats against ordinary people. He goes on to say it's all the Rockefellers and alludes to the Illuminati. Well, I don't know about that part, but normal people being marginalized and us entering a plutocracy? Yeah, right again. Now, I'll run through this as fast as I can because I don't want to bore people. See, I'm not currently occupying the Statue of Liberty with an armed militia, so it's harder for me to get an audience than this guy, but here we go. Besides the stuff he was talking about, there are so many metrics you can look at that back up what he's saying. How about wages as a percent of GDP? Yeah, that's been going down. So when you hear the economy is great, well, that's nice. That means some shareholders making bank. Probably not the actual employees of a company. And hey, surely we're not living in a plutocracy. I mean, we can vote, right? Well, guess what? 91% of the time, whichever candidate has the most money is the one that wins. So if you're an informed voter and weigh candidate platforms, that doesn't matter. 10 times out of 11, the only thing that matters is how many ads Joe Voter sees. And you can buy that. Want to know who's going to win the next election? Money, that's who's going to win. But you might be saying, hey, those officials can still represent us, right? Well, no, not really. There's a famous study floating around showing that over 20 years, almost 1,800 policy outcomes were analyzed by financial influence, and it showed that average citizens have statistically no influence over policy decisions, whereas wealthy individuals and business interests had a significant amount. Even though politicians are elected to represent the people, they really only represent the people who pay them the most. That might be why over a half of Congress is composed of millionaires. Now, I'm focusing mainly on the USA, but stuff like this is manifesting itself globally in different ways. Like, hey, did you know it's been deduced by analyzing bank data around the world that there's at least $21 trillion in secret offshore bank accounts that aren't subject to tax? Yeah, I didn't say that number wrong. It's 21 trillion, and that's showing us the most conservative estimate. It could be 31 trillion, and that was back in 2012, so it's probably higher now. And don't get this mixed up with a completely different study in 2015 showing US corporations as holding 2.1 trillion in offshore banks to avoid taxes. That's small time compared to what's out there. So, yeah, back to Deus Ex, seeing this in a game kind of blew my mind. Not because I never heard this stuff, but I had never seen this in a mainstream game presented with actual facts. You almost never see this stuff on the news, or if it's in popular media, it's been simplified or distorted to the point where it might as well be a kid's cartoon. Meanwhile, here's Deus Ex just slipping it in the middle of a really great game and subtly showing how some of this works. There are reasons you see homeless after homeless after homeless person. This is where a plutocracy takes us. Now, unlike Deus Ex, I don't think our current plutocracy transition is the result of an Illuminati conspiracy. I think it's more that ruthless, rich people tend to think alike, and what we're seeing is a concerted effort of many powerful individuals independently manipulating the system to achieve their ends. So it's not a secret order with rituals and shit. That would be kind of cool. No, it's more like a ruling class. See, a rich person with an agenda pays lobbyists to influence politicians to get laws passed that further his agenda. That politician gets re-elected because he has the money, and the cycle continues. Now, unlike Deus Ex, that agenda isn't to take over the world. At least, I don't think. Instead, it's usually some flavor of changing laws so that businesses said person owns or is invested in become even more profitable, at the expense of pretty much anything else. That's the important part. That's what leads to all the other problems. And by rich, I'm talking Scrooge McDuck or Richie Rich, rich. If you're not on a first name basis with multiple representatives on the national level, you're not even on this chart. And meanwhile, besides fueling politicians, said rich person may simultaneously fund media organizations or think tanks to promote narratives or even propaganda to try and get the rest of the public thinking the way they do, or at least suppress or obfuscate dissent. Hey, to add to No Hair's fact list here, in 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 different companies. Today, the same 90% is controlled by 6. So that means if there's any agenda the people running them happen to agree on, they can direct the attention of the whole country towards that. Or more importantly, away from something they don't want discussed. With that kind of influence, you can affect the flow of history. Deus Ex. Now I know this is getting long, but the game goes a step further. When I first played this game, I thought it was great, but I remember thinking so many references to terrorism seemed a little over the top and almost preachy to the point of detracting from the game. The Statue of Liberty has been bombed by terrorists. There are frequent news bulletins on terrorism. You work for an anti-terrorism agency. Terrorism, all the time. And then 9/11 happened. It's important to remember this game was made before 9/11. Okay, for anyone younger in the audience, I need to explain something. Hearing news commentators, politicians, and the media in general talk about terrorism all the time didn't used to be normal, at least in the US. Prior to 9/11, the average person heard about terrorists more from Arnold Schwarzenegger movies than they did from the mainstream media. I mean, they would still cover events, but it wasn't like clockwork multiple times a week, if not every day. But since 9/11, it hasn't stopped. All the terrorism dialogue in Deus Ex doesn't even feel like an exaggeration now. The game was prophetic. I mean, everybody likes to point out that if you look at the New York City skyline in the game, the two towers aren't there. Now this is just a coincidence. The real reason is because of a texture size engine limitation. But man, that sure goes a ways towards future-proofing this thing. But back to terrorism. The way we talk about terrorism now, you'd think it's the largest problem on Earth. Now, I have to be careful what I say here because this is the internet, so let me be clear. Terrorism is a problem and should be fought. But hear me out. It's impossible to get an exact number, but we currently spend approximately $100 billion a year combating terrorism. But any given year, more people die from being hit by lightning than from terrorism. Most years in the US, you're more likely to die from bee stings. However, the thing with security is you don't see what you prevent. So you might think 100 billion a year is reasonable. After all, almost 3,000 died from 9/11. But here's the thing. There's public evidence that the CIA knew an attack from Al-Qaeda was imminent as early as spring of 2001. They repeatedly tried to warn the Bush administration an attack was coming so that they would put the government on high alert. And during that time, there were some Al-Qaeda contacts that slipped through that likely wouldn't have if we had been on high alert like they advised. The Bush administration, however, did not take these threats seriously. Now this is speculation, so we can never know for certain. But there is hard evidence showing that if someone besides Bush was president, or if he simply took the CIA seriously, the 9/11 attacks might never have happened. Let that sink in for a minute. It's almost as if we're living in an alternate bad timeline. Although we did dodge the Cuban Missile Crisis. That would have been worse. Man, I try to avoid politics in these videos, but I can't for Deus Ex. It's just too relevant.
In a former life, I was a mule dragging a stone plow up a hill in northern Thailand.
The point of all this is it wasn't a lack of resources that led to the 9/11 attacks. But none of that mattered. After 9/11, we ushered in the Patriot Act, Homeland Security, the TSA, we invaded Iraq, we added counter-terrorist funding for local police, and the media has not stopped talking about it since. We also lost some constitutional rights in the process, are spending $100 billion a year on this, and it's not clear we're any safer than before all this happened. In Deus Ex, UNATCO is formed after the Statue of Liberty is bombed. Just like the two towers, this is super symbolic and mobilizes Congress to set up a new agency to tackle the problem. But why are we setting up all these new agencies and spending $100 billion a year when all we needed to do was let the CIA do its damn job? Because there's $100 billion a year to be made on this stuff. Back to this chart, guess who some of these rich people are? Defense contractors! Like Tony Stark, except without the morality. This is what's known as the military-industrial complex. Essentially, if we're not at war with somebody, somewhere, then they're losing money and they can't have that. So this is all the same thing as before, except this one involves the military. So terrorism is our new global enemy, and it needs to stay that way so that Obadiah here can keep getting a slice of that 100 billion. And not just him, everyone who works at Stark Industries or is connected to it. It's self-perpetuating. And as a bonus, the more time goes on and you start hollowing out society, you might actually see some homegrown terrorists trying to fight the system, like the NSF and Deus Ex. And that in turn increases the demand for more of a counter-terrorist economy. It just keeps going. I'm normally not much of a conspiracy theory person, but if there's tons of evidence for something happening, and there's a whole lot of money to be made by not calling attention to it, then yeah, I get suspicious. Some of you may know that Eisenhower in his farewell speech explicitly warned about the military-industrial complex and considered it the greatest threat to our democracy.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
But hey, he was only President of the United States and Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. What did he know? This is how the world works, guys. And that's the third layer of the story of Deus Ex. It's more than a game. It's illustrating not only real-world issues, but arguably a couple of the biggest ones that are shaping everything about our civilization and giving us a glimpse of how it works and where it's taking us.